Hi everyone, my name is Kirsten Verklaas from NASEO. Thank you for joining for the Microgrid Planning and Deployment for Community Resilience webinar. We're just going to give it one more minute and then we got started. Thank you. Hi everyone, my name is Kirsten Verklaas. I'm the Program Director for Electricity at NASEO. Welcome to the NARUC NASEO Microgrid State Working Group webinar on microgrid planning and deployment for community and resilience. I wanted to just go over briefly the agenda and do some logistics. As you know, through GoToWebinar, you can ask questions. We ask you, because this is a webinar with quite a few attendees, to just use the question and chat box for your questions throughout the webinar, and we'll have about 15 minutes at the end for a Q&A. And we also have some handouts. One of the presenters will talk about the Oregon Resilience Guidebook, which is in the handout sections. And then in the chat box, I also want to direct you to a link to download SEPA's Microgrid Playbook. We'll also have the webinar slides available for you at the end, which will be posted to the NASEO NARUC Microgrid Working Group site on NASEO's website. So we're really pleased today to have three great speakers to talk about a microgrid and resilience, and I will introduce them right off the bat now, and then turn over the presentations to each of them. But I wanted to provide the bios, their quick bios right now. Jared Leader with the Smart Electric Power Alliance, SEPA, develops strategic plans for programs, products, and services offerings for utility and industry stakeholder members and clients that facilitate the integration of distributed energy resources, non-wires alternatives, and microgrids onto the modern grid. He leads SEPA's Microgrids Working Group and co-led the DC Public Service Commission's Grid Modernization Working Group. Russell Ragsdale is the Director of Asset and Engineering Strategy at Southern California Edison. And in his role, he is responsible for developing asset strategies, which includes decisions across the asset lifecycle, evolution of the maintenance and inspection process, and evaluation of new technologies. Russell has 17 years of experience of the electric utility in the areas of distribution system planning, grid modernization, strategic planning, and performance management. Adam Schultz with the Oregon Department of Energy is a senior policy analyst since 2016, and he's the lead for issues related to the Bonneville Power Administration and public power. He also focused on substantive issues related to grid integration, energy markets, resource adequacy, and energy resilience. So with that, I'm pleased to hand it over to Jared Leader to start us off at this webinar.
Hey, thank you so much. Thank you, Kirsten and Kira, for inviting me to speak, and it's been a pleasure to work with you all. Excited to make this presentation to the state working group. So, as Kirsten mentioned, this is Jared Leader. I'm the industry strategy manager at SEPA, and one thing that we're looking at SEPA in terms of microgrids is just one tool in the energy toolbox against resiliency. And as we know, climate change is causing an increasing number and severity of natural disasters. NOAA reported in 2019 alone just 14 natural disasters causing damages of over 1 billion with a B each in the U.S. So there is more scrutiny over resiliency, and microgrids we see as one of those tools to evaluate when you're looking at increasing resiliency. So next slide, who's SEPA? Many of you might know already, but just as a refresher, we're a 501c3 membership organization. We are based in DC. However, I am located in Salt Lake, Utah. Our vision is a carbon-free energy system by 2050, and our mission is to facilitate the electric power industry's smart transition to a clean and modern energy future. So what does that exactly mean? The next slide gives a bit of an overview, but really that means we are providing research and education to our members and our clients on topics that we put into different pathways: DER, grid integration, regulatory innovation, transportation electrification, and utility business models. So I work in the industry strategy group, and we do a lot of grant and consulting related projects with governmental and utility clients. So that first bucket in custom projects, but we deliver workshops, research reports, webinars. One thing I wanted to mention, since I know a lot of you on the phone here are part of an employee of a state energy office or a public utility commission, as an employee, we offer enterprise-wide complimentary SEPA memberships, and that means you can get access to all of the work we do, and including the Microgrid Playbook, which I'm excited to share with you all today. So this next slide here introduces the playbook. So a lot of what we're going to go over is just an overview of the work that we've done. But it's important to note that this playbook, it's conceptually and generally culminates from a lot of the work that we've done in the field, and it's been demonstrated in the field and based on our work engaging utility and government entities in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, and on the West Coast, with specific utilities to explore certain plans for microgrids. And it is intended to be used by state energy offices and utility commissions and utilities to identify and help evaluate potential microgrid deployment to increase resiliency. So before we get right into it, the next slide, it's titled Defining Key Terms, but we're not really going to do that right now. I mean, there are definitions of microgrids that are widely agreed upon in the industry. These are components of the U.S. Department of Energy. This is some components of different definitions from resilience, but really it depends on who you ask. And it's very important to break down those perspectives of resiliency and how different stakeholders may value microgrids in order to have those conversations and ultimately design programs and projects that benefit the most. So why microgrids, or why understand different perspectives and have these conversations early? The next slide has a nice little diagram here of different perspectives on resilience and microgrid value. Microgrids can't be developed economically without robust coordination between utilities, communities, and customers to really fully understand the problem and all the benefits a microgrid can provide. A lot of the questions that our members and our clients ask when we're discussing microgrids is who benefits and who pays. Customers value avoiding power interruptions and maintaining critical operations and economic productions. What utilities value: maintaining safe and efficient operations with highly reliable service. Likewise, communities value avoiding power interruptions, but more focus on the critical services. It's really important to understand all of those different perspectives in order to develop a microgrid project that really impacts everyone positively, and you can start stacking some of those benefits. So this next slide, taking this perspective approach one step further, you can look
Hey Jared,
at—
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think we might be a few slides back.
Oh, so you can just forward one slide.
Kirsten, I'm still seeing the overview slide.
I'm still seeing the overview slide too. I can continue kind of talking through my slides, but I'm not sure if everyone can see them right
now. Yeah, Kirsten, can you advance the slides for us? Sorry for our technical difficulties.
I guess I'll use this opportunity. So this playbook, it was developed in coordination with a lot of different utilities and different members of SEPAs. We worked with our working group, Microgrids working group, to kind of collect some of the input, including SCE, Portland General Electric. So it's a resource that's available to SEPA members. And what we did, because it's typically behind a paywall, we developed a link that you can easily kind of click a link and you can fill out a form. So I think that's the link I put in the chat box, but I think the organizers will also be sending out a link where you can download this and look at it in more detail.
Well, Jared, I apologize for the technical difficulties. I'll try to work things out with Kirsten if you want to keep going through your presentation, and we will, of course, have the slides to share afterwards.
Sure. So I'll add a little bit more color than just normal, given you're not all following through the slides. But what I was, where I was saying is the importance of understanding the perspectives. We've looked at the different perspectives of microgrids and resiliency value between the utility, the community, and the customer. Talking about who benefits and who pays is really important, but also how you can look at how a microgrid project could stack different value streams. So at microgrid, really, there are different use cases. There are different segments, different applications, utility operations, public safety, healthcare, military, industrial, agricultural. But when it's one microgrid that can be multifunctional, that's when they really can be economical. And a great example is with Portland General Electric, and they partnered with the city of Beaverton, which is a community outside of Portland, and they're developing a microgrid that's both going to provide bulk scale system-wide benefits to grid reliability, as well as local resiliency for a community hub and a police station headquarters. So that's just great examples of value stacking. And what Portland General Electric did was truly understand that this microgrid could benefit more than just the utility, more than just a single individual customer, also can provide system-wide benefits. So that's important. Now that that understanding of values and services microgrid provides, the playbook also looks at specific natural disaster use cases. So going into the specific use case of an earthquake, for example, in the slides, there's a picture of the Cascadia subduction zone that goes across the Pacific Northwest, which many of you might know, it's received a lot of attention recently from geotechnical engineers, geologists, so forth, for the increased risk of earthquakes and liquefaction. So in this region, designing a microgrid and planning a microgrid around earthquakes as the threat, you can look at specifically how you can harden the microgrid. So we cover a comprehensive set of microgrid strategies in this playbook that really get at hardening the microgrid itself and the facilities it's serving, because really what good does a microgrid do without proper physical protections? And the parts which make up the whole must also be resilient. Strength against earthquakes, shake resistant, seismic hardening, so forth.
Hey Jared, I'm sorry to interrupt again. This is Kira. It seems like Kirsten is having some internet issues. But if you're
Okay.
able actually to pull up your slides, I think I can transfer control over to you and you can share your screen.
Okay, yeah, let's try it. That works.
All right. So it's over to you, and you should have a sharing tab at the top. Yep, it looks like we're seeing it. Sorry about that.
No worries. Okay, great. Well, now that you can follow me, it makes life a little bit easier. So this is the first use case that we cover in the playbook with earthquakes, like I said, the Pacific Northwest. But really the point is it's you can't have a resilient system as a whole or a strategy without focusing on the actual resilience of the microgrid itself or the facilities that it serves. So addressing geotechnical concerns, structural and equipment seismic hardening, especially against earthquakes, is critical. The next use case, same idea, hurricanes. This is a picture from the work that we did in Puerto Rico that SEPA developed for the governor's office in Puerto Rico, which shows all hypothetical microgrid locations across Puerto Rico for increased resilience at specific critical infrastructure sites. But same idea here in terms of you looking at your threats, high winds, flooding, and designing a system in a microgrid that can protect against those. I'll let Russell talk more about wildfires in Southern California and what they're doing across the state of California. But I will mention it's unique. Designing a strategy against wildfires is a bit unique, especially with this concept that in certain areas, the wildfire risk is so high that utilities are being forced to shut down power in certain circuits to prevent against wildfires and prevent against catastrophic damages. And there's some unique solutions that microgrids could provide to work against that and mitigate the overall impact to the community that may be impacted. So, things like siting microgrids near impacted areas where they can serve as a community hub for people of the public that might be out of power. You could go to power, get access to public services. And I'll let Russell kind of discuss a little bit more about Southern California's strategy in terms of siting against wildfires. So the culmination of this playbook in our work, it comes down to a framework, and it's a process that SEPA has. And it's very similar to a lot of other industry processes that are focused on resilience. Most processes, you identify your threats, you identify vulnerabilities and criticality, and then you ultimately roll out resilience solutions to address those. What SEPA's framework is a threat specific, focused on natural disasters, and a solution specific, focused on microgrids. So the first step is simply identifying the critical infrastructure and critical customers and critical sites. This is typically consistent across the board. You see things like hospitals, correctional facilities, wastewater treatment facilities, so forth. But it's important to engage with your customers, to have conversations with your stakeholders, truly to understand and prioritize what's most important, because many communities and different jurisdictions may put value on one type of facility over another, and it's critical that this is the first step. You want to identify the sites, but you also want to talk to your customers and your stakeholders to determine the best sites. One thing that I know SCE does and many other utilities do is they also look at customers that have existing DERs and existing on-site generation, where you can potentially leverage that for retrofitting a microgrid. So that's also part of this initial step. So once you go through that initial step, the next step is to identify vulnerable areas or identify high-risk areas. You might be seeing where this is going with the third step, but this is, it also is important to engage all the right players to understand what the vulnerable areas are, and this is very case by case. Clearly, depending on where you are around the country, you may have one primary threat, you might have secondary, tertiary threats that you also should consider that also need to be incorporated into this process. I alluded to it earlier, but then the third step really is to, once you have this critical sites, once you understand the vulnerable areas, you want to make a list and you want to start listing out all the different potential sites that are critical, determined by stakeholders, and also within areas that are impacted or affected. And this could be in a form of initial map, overlaying all the vulnerable areas. Again, the types of questions you may also want to consider as a deal sweetener for certain microgrid sites could be, there could be areas that are also within capacity or reliability constrained areas of the grid that could align well with a non-wires alternative, or just other ways similar to what Portland General Electric did in terms of benefiting bulk scale while also focusing on the community. So here's the practical step. This is the preliminary microgrid design step. Once you're getting down to sizing, you have a list of potential microgrids, and you can understand based on their energy consumption data, you can start thinking through what type of assets and what the microgrid can actually, what needs to actually be designed to achieve your objective. And I'll note right here as a good example, you know, many areas permitting and emissions is critical. And when I was talking to Russell, your colleague, Josh Mousy with SCE, he mentioned that that's actually something that you're all looking at as well in terms of a siting criteria where things can be permitted. But it all goes into the impacts on the actual system and whether it's a low or a moderate or an aggressive renewable microgrid design. Lastly, this is where it all kind of comes together. But once you go through the steps of identifying critical sites, you identify vulnerable areas, you start laying them out and understand which fall into which areas. Then you want to have a discussion around, okay, are there some areas where we can group sites together? There are some specific examples in Illinois with the Bronzeville community microgrid where there's different critical sites all in one location, and there's the clustered approach is more economical and it makes more sense. So this is, you know, kind of that step where you're determining whether microgrids are going to be located at site-specific levels or community level. In Puerto Rico, we determined that there were certain areas where there was only one critical site. So that was essential that there would be a microgrid sited there for backup. Now, in some more rural and remote areas where you had several different facilities located in one community or one neighborhood, that's when a community or transformer level microgrid is the right approach. So I'm not going to go through each of these conclusions, but I'll wrap up with, you know, we at SEPA have done work with state energy offices and public utility commissions, and the type of work really we do is to identify potential ways where microgrids can attribute to the overall resiliency of your state, of your local jurisdiction, and using this tool is our approach, and it can be worthwhile to walk through, but really the most important thing is to engage stakeholders early and often so you can identify sites that work for everyone and you can get total buy-in and potentially joint investment from a customer or within a community. So with that, I think we're going to do questions later. You feel free to contact me, and there's my email address, number, happy to chat. And I know we'll be sending out a link to the playbook so you can learn more about it and read more. So I'm not sure if Kirsten's back, but Kira, do you want to take control?
Sure, thank you, Jared. So I think next up we will have
Yeah, this is Russ. I'll be going next.
Russell. Okay, thanks. And let me transfer control over to you. And all right, so you have it. And if you have your slides up, you can start sharing those. And we have had some questions come in the question box. So I'm gonna save those for after the presentations. So just know if you send something in, it will be read out a little bit later. You can also raise your hand if you'd like to get off of mute and then ask your question directly to one of the panelists. So Russell, looks like we can see yours.
Oops, let me make sure I'm putting it on the right screen here. All right, how's that? Do we have a full screen?
Yes, that looks great. Thanks.
Okay, yep. Actually, before I get into that, I just want to thank you to Kira and Kirsten for this opportunity to share with you all kind of our thought process on microgrids and kind of how they fit in resilience. You know, full disclosure here, we are still learning about microgrids, relatively early in the process. I'll share with you kind of our latest thinking and the approach, but still have a lot to learn in the space. Thank you to Jared and SEPA for being a great partner in this journey, and I think the playbook is something that's going to be really helpful as we continue to think about where and when are the right place to deploy microgrids. So in California, you know, we've had some impacts from climate change, to put it mildly, and wildfires is becoming a serious concern, or is a serious concern for us here in California. At Southern California Edison, we really look to a future where we're using carbon-free resources to power the economy. We've published a few white papers, you know, really outlining what we think is the path to a clean energy economy and how we think we can help this. But in the interim and in the meantime, we do need to find a way to be able to mitigate these risks and these impacts that we're seeing from climate change. We've seen increasing fires, and you know, we want to make sure that our customers are safe, that our communities are safe, and we want to make sure that we can really focus on advancing to that clean energy economy that we're looking forward to. So this is just a little bit of context of kind of what we're dealing with in California. At Southern California Edison, we are looking at several different options to mitigate the risk of wildfire. One is through infrastructure. So looking at where we can install covered conductor to mitigate the risk of foreign objects coming into contact with the lines. Looking at other hardening activities like you know, changing wood poles to composite poles, using various protection devices to reduce the amount of energy that's delivered to faults, and then looking at new technologies in areas where we can interrupt circuits faster or even before conditions happen. Also looking at undergrounding as an option to reduce or eliminate the risk. In terms of situational awareness, we're advancing our capabilities there. We've installed numerous weather stations and cameras throughout our service territory. We're building modeling and predictive capabilities. We have supercomputers running to try and identify where risks are going to be emergent from weather conditions and where specifically it's going to happen in the territory. And on the operational side, looking at performing inspections differently, maybe more specifically to mitigate wildfire risk than we had done in the past. And this is our transmission and distribution infrastructure, looking at equipment that potentially failure of could lead to risk of ignition, looking at how we inspect that equipment, and then also doing things like infrared scanning, corona scanning, to really understand where there's potential risks out there, where there's possibility of failure of equipment and lines. On the vegetation side, looking at performing brush clearing at poles, evaluating trees that are adjacent to the lines where they're identified as hazard trees or potentially fall and create issues, and then using LiDAR technology to look at spacing between lines and trees and sizes of those. And then the final measure here, Jared alluded to in his presentation, is public safety power shutoff. And this is where we proactively de-energize section of lines during high fire conditions to reduce that risk of ignition. Public safety power shutoffs is something that we take very seriously at Southern Cal Edison. You know, we've been in business for 130 years, and it's really been about keeping the lights on for customers. So this is something new to us, but we recognize that it's a necessary mitigation that we have to take, especially when the risks are very high. In 2019, throughout the year, we had 537 of our feeders, of our circuits, that we were watching and evaluating to see if we needed to interrupt if the fire conditions exceeded thresholds. We did interrupt 138 circuits, not always the entire circuit. We have gone through a lot of efforts to really try and minimize the amount of customers that are impacted and look for places along the circuit that we can isolate. But we did have 9 PSPS events, and it impacted over 100,000 customers. The average duration of those interruptions were 27 hours. We think microgrids are a potential solution to mitigate the impacts of PSPS. In certain areas of the service territory, the way the system's designed and the way the infrastructure is located may create an opportunity for us to use microgrids to keep customers energized even during those risk scenarios where we need to interrupt. But we are looking at many different solutions to mitigate the impacts of PSPS. We're looking at installing more switches and sectionalizing capability to, again, reduce the number of customers that are impacted when we have to de-energize. Going along with that are a series of playbooks that we've developed that draws out for our operations folks the different switching that could take place to minimize the number of customers that are impacted. We're looking at accelerating some of our infrastructure work, cover conductor, because we know that reduces the risk and will reduce the number of times and the duration in which we do PSPS. We're looking at deploying customer resource centers, areas where customers can go to charge their phone or you know, maybe obtain bottles of water or some small services, because we know that you know, customers are heavily impacted when we're shutting off the power. And then also looking to increase the situational awareness by adding more weather stations, which gives us a much more granular kind of view of the circuit and where the risks are, which again helps us to minimize the number of customers that are impacted. Back to microgrids, you know, we started to think about microgrids as tools for mitigating PSPS. But just to level set, you know, everybody probably gets a different picture in their head when they think about the word microgrid and what it means. One person said, you know, if you've seen one microgrid, then you've seen one microgrid. They're not all the same, they're all different. So here, just trying to highlight that there are some microgrids that we call behind the meter that typically are supporting a single customer, and then other microgrids that we're calling front of the meter, which may be more, or you may call this a community level microgrid, where it supports multiple customers. The other difference between microgrids is the generation. You know, again, aligned with our vision that I outlined earlier for Southern California Edison. Our preference would be to leverage renewable resources if we're doing a microgrid. Although we know that comes with a time, you know, to install and get those resources. It comes with a cost. You need space and land or rooftops, depending on what the resources are. And so we recognize that in the short term, there may be microgrids that are leveraging fossil fuel technology, but you know, the long-term vision of how we use microgrids is aligned with our long-term vision for the power system, which is that it's powered by clean energy resources. Now, in addition to the different types of microgrids, there's also different costs around microgrids, and this is, you know, probably evident to a lot of people, but I thought it was something important to highlight, because as we're looking at microgrids as potential solutions, we're looking at all of the other solutions that we could deploy, and it comes down to the cost comparisons. It's an important part, because not only do we want to you know, provide safe, reliable power to our customers, but we want it to be cost effective as well. So a couple studies here, one report by the CEC and another study by NREL kind of highlighted some costs, and these are, you know, a couple years old, so probably some changes, but I think they're in the ballpark based on what we found. And these are costs per megawatt. So you see kind of you know, the California costs as compared to North America, and then the global costs being even less on the left side there. And then on the right side, you can see that what NREL's done here is break it down by different market segments. So whether you're kind of campus or commercial, industrial, community, different costs associated with those. And again, you know, these charts, I think, point to some of the differences in microgrids in terms of the size. So there's this CEC study talked about how California is focused on smaller inverter-based projects, which reduces some of the costs. However, you do get some economies of scale when you get to the larger, like, community-based microgrids. At least that's what we've seen in some of the offerings. The other thing that impacts microgrids, which I think the chart on the right highlights, is the different loads that you're trying to serve. So if you're serving residential load versus large commercial industrial load, the microgrid generation and characteristics are different, and those can lead to different costs. The other thing just to point out here is that these are costs per megawatt. Oftentimes the duration for which you want the microgrid to be able to energize customers makes a big difference in the cost as well. So I mentioned that our PSPS had an average of 27 hours. So if you're looking to kind of keep a community up and running for that amount of time, you're going to get a different cost than if you're looking at 2 days or 3 days, or even perpetuity type microgrids. So not only is the size of microgrid, but the duration, the type of loads, important considerations. And they're expensive. But you know, the statement down here on the bottom is, and Jared made this point in his presentation as well, realizing additional value streams, I think, is an important component of making microgrids more cost effective, especially in resiliency circumstances where you're not using them all the time. Being able to leverage those resources for market products or for other benefits to really increase the cost effectiveness is key. And then the last slide here, again, this is kind of supporting some of the steps that Jared laid out from the playbook. This is kind of the approach that we've taken when selecting some of the locations and some of the considerations that we've had. So Jared mentioned the first one. If there's existing or planned DERs that we could coordinate, you know, that helps with cost effectiveness. You don't have to construct or site new resources. If you have facilities that are kind of in close proximity, then your microgrid infrastructure does not have to be as extensive. It doesn't have to be as large, and you can use, you know, existing infrastructure, and you know, that can bring costs down. When we're looking at the types of customers, you know, obviously you want to look at customers that are essential or critical, but we also want to look at disadvantaged communities. We recognize that that's an important part of the customer base, and so we've highlighted that as one of the criteria when we're looking at deploying microgrids. And then we've looked at, you know, of course, areas that are subject to the PSPS and are undergrounded. what we don't want to do is create a microgrid that energizes a portion of the service territory that is still a high-risk area, and then we're kind of counteracting some of the wildfire risk mitigation. And so looking for areas that are undergrounded helps to identify areas that can be energized, but will not represent any additional wildfire risk. And so we have some parts of our service territory where you have a long overhead line, but then a section of the customers that are fed by that are underground, and so it might be a housing tract or some other situation like that. And these pictures, if you can see them, have some examples of that. In high fire areas is what we looked at, and then also looked at just general reliability on the circuit. Again, wanting to make sure that we can leverage the microgrid for the most benefit and value. And so looking for areas where it can provide not only resiliency benefit, but reliability benefit. So that's the approach we're taking. Again, appreciate the work that SEPA is doing, and still continue to learn about where microgrids make the most sense, how we can make them the most cost effective. But we absolutely believe they're a tool in the toolbox, and something that is worth continuing to investigate. So my next slide says Q&A, but I think we're going to wait till the end for that. So I'm going to pass it back to Kira.
Thanks, Russell. So Adam, I think we'll go over to you now. I'll make you the panelist, and if you can go ahead and share your slides.
Great. And while I'm getting this set up, can we do a time check on where we are on time?
Sure. So if you want to take about 10 minutes, wrap up, around 2:55 or a couple minutes before. It's okay if we have Q&A go a little bit past 3 o'clock, since we had some trouble at the beginning. So we do want to make sure that we give you plenty of time to get through your slides. Great. I just want to check, are you guys seeing my full screen slides now? We're seeing the presenter mode.
Get to the right one here. Well, I'm having trouble figuring out how to get it to the right. Sorry, I'm having trouble here figuring out how to switch over to the full screen. There, I'll do it this way. Does that work now?
That looks good. Yeah, it's full screen now.
Great. Sorry about that. So as was mentioned earlier, I'm Adam Schultz, a senior analyst at the Oregon Department of Energy. I'll try to go through these kind of quick since we're a bit short on time. Not surprisingly, we're the state energy office here in the state of Oregon, have a variety of responsibilities. I won't dwell on these. I work primarily in the Planning and Innovation Division on energy policy issues, including energy resilience. In addition to the work I'm going to talk about, I just want to give a brief overview of where we fit sort of in the broader energy resilience landscape. We are the lead for the petroleum sector for ESF 12 functions. Developed recently a fuel action plan that details the state's detailed response plan for severe shortages of liquid fuels. And then I will go into some more detail on the resilience guidebook, which was mentioned briefly earlier, and to which you have a link shared in the webinar. But first, before I get to that, just a quick overview. I want to do a kind of national presentation to give some context of kind of what the landscape looks like here in Oregon. As you might be aware, Oregon is a pretty large state, about 98,000 square miles. For some context for East Coasters, about 5% larger than the mid-Atlantic states I've got highlighted there, but importantly, 7 times fewer people, so much less dense. It's a very rural state. As you can see here, we really, our population is consolidated in the northwest corner of the state, in the Willamette Valley, Greater Portland metro area down through Eugene. That's again reflected here. We have 18 rural electric co-ops that serve only 10% of the state's population, but as you can see by the map, they cover a very large geography. Half of them serving fewer than 5,000 customers, to give you some sense of the level of rural communities we're talking about here. So why am I going into that much detail? So the reason why is that we have some, I think, unique but maybe not so unique threats to resilience. We have a diverse range of threats. First, we have certainly the wildfire issues, which we just heard about from SoCal Edison. Those issues have certainly gotten a lot of attention here in the Northwest. We have less areas in high risk than California, certainly, but we still have some, and our utilities have started developing public safety power shutoff protocols. We also have increasingly severe winter ice storms. An example here, last winter, we had one of our co-ops had its customers out for over a week and a half. And then as was already mentioned, I believe by the first presenter, Jared, the Cascadia subduction zone earthquake is really the first threat that comes to mind for a lot of folks here in the Northwest. I won't dwell on the chart here, but what this shows is the last 10,000 years of ruptures of that fault. And if you do the math and talk to the geologists, they say we're essentially due, and the odds are somewhere around 30 or 40% that there's a major rupture on the scale of 8 to 9.0 sometime this century. And the shake map there right is sort of a model of what the shaking is likely to be like. So covering quite a large area of the state, including that Northwest area with quite a bit of population. And the reason why that's obviously important, other than just the immediate impact of the event, is that this map here is showing the red lines, the bulk transmission system on the electric side in the state, and the critical fuel hub, which I've highlighted here. 90% of the liquid fuels in the state come through here. It's right along the banks of the confluence of the Willamette and Columbia Rivers, northwest of Portland, on liquefiable soils. It's not in a good situation. So a few years ago, the state developed the Oregon Resilience Plan that looked across different sectors of the economy at how we would be likely to fare if the earthquake happened today. And I just highlight here some of the findings. The expectation is the coastal areas will be 6 months to a year to restore up to 90% operation of the electric system. And the Willamette Valley there from Portland to Eugene, where most of the population lives, we're still talking weeks to months to restore 90% operation of the grid. So that's sort of the context of why we developed this guidebook for local energy resilience. We did it in partnership with the National Governors Association. They supported the project and really brought in some national resources to help us. And we really developed it in partnership with Central Lincoln People's Utility District, one of our 37 public utilities across the state. They occupy the Central Oregon coastline, so they're really front and center for this earthquake risk, earthquake and tsunami risk, I should say. So what we did is we really tried to develop a resource for staff at our public utilities. So I showed you the co-ops earlier. We worked with one of the PUDs in developing this. We also have several, about a dozen municipal utilities, 37 total public utilities. In all, we really developed this as a resource for staff at those utilities. They're smaller utilities, smaller revenues, a lot fewer staff. They don't have the same resources and ability to focus on these issues like a major IOU like SoCal Edison or Portland General Electric would. So we really tried to develop this to help level set the conversation and give them a resource. But as you can see here, it's the second major component of the guidebook, community energy resilience, is where we focused on DERs and microgrids, but we really have a lot of information in here really around business continuity planning for small utilities and around the landscape of federal and state emergency planning and where local utilities fit into that context. Just to really give them a usable resource off the shelf to help them get grounded in these issues. But going through it quickly here on the microgrid DER side of things, we really focus on this term community energy resilience. I think you're hearing a lot of the similar themes from all of the speakers today, but to us, this is about maintaining the availability of energy needed to support the provision of energy-dependent critical public services, such as these guys here. Not surprisingly, water and wastewater plants, schools and community centers, medical facilities, first responders, police, fire, EMS. Those are the types of entities that we're really focused on at the state level. A good example of this here, eWeb, our largest public utility in the state in Eugene, last year went live with a solar and storage microgrid at an elementary school, passed out water jugs to customers, where they also have a groundwater well there, and really did a PR push to let their customers know about this new effort they have to be able to provide community power, and in this case, emergency water pumping following a major event, whether it's the earthquake, a major wildfire, or a winter storm. So this is really the type of project that we at the state are interested in seeing more of, and would like to find ways to support. Just real briefly, lots of good tools out there from the national labs that we direct our utilities to help them better understand some of the technology parameters and potential costs of developing some of these solutions. And then to wrap this up quickly, so we can get to the good part, the questions. Kind of where we see this going in the state is really we're at the level setting and conversation level of just trying to get folks thinking about this in the same way. So expanding that conversation with more utilities and bringing in local governments to really get some synergies and coordination, thinking about the variety of benefits you can get from these community resilience projects. Certainly you have grid benefits, but you also have very real community benefits in terms of maintenance of water pumping capabilities, or having power at a community shelter. Those are really real benefits, but that gets into the second next step, which is a developing evaluation framework. We're really interested in identifying technical assistance from wherever it exists out there to help develop a framework and quantify the value of all these benefits to the different entities, and then ultimately, of course, identifying funding mechanisms, because we feel like the way these projects really can be funded in a systemic way will be to identify multiple funding streams that can allocate the costs of these diverse benefits. So the utility maybe pays for a portion to get the to add renewables to the system, and maybe have some ancillary services or capacity benefit. The local community might be willing to put in some grant money because of that community resilience benefit, and maybe the state has an interest as well. So trying to come up with a framework for funding that allocates those costs to all the beneficiaries is something that we're really interested in trying to do. And the guidebook is available online. You also have it here. But happy to take questions now, or follow up anytime in the future. There is my contact info, and sorry I ran through that kind of quickly, but I wanted to make sure we had time for questions.
Thanks, Adam. So we have been getting some questions in. I think we had a couple of clarifying questions back on Jared's slides from Michael Hornsby in New Jersey. He was asking, does this guidance pertain to L1, L2, or L3 microgrids?
Yeah, so I think the question in New Jersey, there's different levels that were designated from the Department of Energy for the New Jersey Town Center DER project, and there were level 1, level 2, level 3. So the question is around, does our playbook kind of address that? Is that what the question was?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, so that really gets at the final step. Once you are looking at all the different types of loads that are critical, or businesses that are critical, or different facilities that potentially could be served by a microgrid, then there is a determination whether you would want to deploy a level 1, level 2, or level 3. Russell alluded to it. There's, if there's certain loads that are on one circuit that is impacted, potentially a level 2 or a level 3 microgrid would be more economical just for economies of scale. But what we saw in Puerto Rico, there were certain sites that were more standalone. For example, a wastewater treatment plant that was in an area not really located next to other types of critical facilities that you think of maybe placing microgrid around. So that would be more around a level 1 or a level 2. I hope that answers the question, but I think that's what you're getting at.
Thanks, Jared. And another one, I think addressed to you, but Russell and Adam can feel free to weigh in. How do you measure the resilience of a microgrid? Failure mode and effects analysis, SAIDI or SAFE metrics, fault tree analysis, or other methods?
Yeah, I'll take a stab, but I'm really curious to hear what the other speakers say, because this is a very new conversation. I know that NARUC came out with a report last year around the value of resiliency, and I think the conclusion was there's just not enough around learnings, or there's just not enough agreement around what the quantification of resiliency is. So I've seen people use ICE, the ICE calculator, for interruptible calculations. I know that NREL is doing work around metrics for business continuity, so surveying economic loss of load. But it is very difficult. Clearly, there have been, as you may know, projects across the country that are being rejected on the basis of not really providing or demonstrating the resiliency benefit to all customers. So I think that's a work in progress. But I go back to the importance of engaging all the stakeholders early, because if you do get buy-in from the individual customers of the community that it will be benefiting, whether it be access to wastewater, whether it be access in Portland to just drinking water at a school, then they're able really to see the benefits and how it impacts them positively in terms of building resiliency. And then when you get down to ultimately who's paying and ultimately whether there's rate recovery involved, you have that buy-in, which is so important. I'm curious to hear what the other speakers say.
Yes, I'll jump in here real quick. This is Adam. So I just, I think it's a great question. To me, just the thing that we are really focused on is really just trying to clearly bucketize or identify in different categories the different types of benefits that there are out there. I think that so often we talk about benefits in the electric sector, and we immediately go to ratepayer benefits and thinking about how this fits into kind of the utility construct. And certainly there are some of those benefits involved with these projects, and I think we should make sure we get those right. And there's, I think utilities would be interested in paying a fair value for the services they can get from these projects. But then you have these other community benefits that aren't the traditional ratepayer benefits that are going to be a big part of this, and that's a much trickier, it's a different kind of question. So, but I think we need to think about all the benefits and how to bundle them all together.
Yeah, just building on what Jared and Adam have said, I think it may differ by use case. So for our particular use case, we're trying to limit the impacts of PSPS. So we measure that based on number of customers impacted and the duration of outages that the customers experience and the number of PSPS events that the customers experience. And so if we were going to deploy a microgrid to reduce that, we would expect those metrics to kind of be able to express that value. But I could see if you're deploying a microgrid for a different purpose, you'd probably be measuring a different set of things. But I think it ultimately comes back to impact on customers. And so I think it's a good question, and probably something that if we can get to a common metric and a common understanding of how you measure it, that would be helpful. But at this point, we're basing it just on the specific use case that we're using them for.
I'm going to try for our next question, unmuting Joe Francis from Nebraska. Joe, go ahead.
I apologize. I hit the wrong button. I do not have a question.
Oh, all right.
Interesting, though. Thank you.
No problem. We have some other questions that have come in on the chat. One is how are you looking at climate and extreme weather projections in the planning process? I think kind of directed towards Adam, but of course anyone else feel free to jump in. What is the source of the information? What's the time horizon that you're looking at? Other parameters around what goes into that process.
Sorry, I missed the beginning of that question. Could you try repeat that?
Sure, it was how are you looking at climate and extreme weather projections in the planning process?
You know, I think we're really at the process of, as I mentioned, is really just trying to educate our stakeholders and having a broader conversation. Certainly climate is an element. Certainly it's contributing to the increased wildfire risk and some of the storms, the ice storms and the wind storms. But really it's, you know, we just are using the resources that are out there. So we rely heavily on the Oregon Department of Forestry. They have wildfire threat maps and that sort of thing where they take climate and other things into account. So we're just making sure that our utilities and local communities are using those resources and using the best available information that's out there. But certainly every community's got a unique set of particular threats, and climate is certainly an element.
All right, our next question is about the COVID-19 pandemic. So the question is, COVID-19 is a natural disaster. It's obviously a little bit different than some of the wildfires and earthquakes and tsunamis that we've discussed in the webinar so far. But how can microgrids help with the COVID-19 pandemic in mitigating the impacts? And I'll add kind of my own spin on this question because I liked when this question came in. Obviously with the SEPA playbook and the guidebook in Oregon, those have been in development for quite a while. So I would ask kind of how the COVID-19 pandemic, if at all, if it's changed the conclusions or the recommendations that SEPA and Oregon are putting forward in those publications.
Yeah, this is Jared. I'll take it. It's a really great question, and I think it's an interesting thought exercise, but it's really impactful right now. And we think about how this all changes how we use energy, what's critical. So I think we need to start asking these questions over again and to the right people. One part of the playbook is to really understand what energy consumption looks like. I think what we're all learning right now is that energy consumption is drastically changing. Different residential loads are increasing, commercial loads are decreasing. The overall just energy pockets or load pockets is changing. So you want to just revisit population density, which is something that I saw in Adam's work in Oregon, as well as it's one of the criteria for us in our process. But you know, people moving into less populated areas. So really, it's a question of energy consumption and overall demographics and how they may change. But it's also, I would say, I want to get the same people in the room and ask them, due to this pandemic, are there specific resources that are now more critical than others? And, you know, I'd be interested to see what those responses are, but, you know, we could speculate that, you know, obviously healthcare facilities rise to the top, access to groceries, gasoline. So, yeah, that's a great question, though.
Yeah, so I guess my initial thoughts on this are, so I think about it from the microgrid perspective in particular. You know, nothing immediately jumps to mind for me in terms of how microgrids benefit in this particular crisis. But that said, you know, and that's one of the reasons in the guidebook that we developed really for the staff at these small public utilities, we didn't just focus on microgrids because there's so much more to resilience. I mean, that's certainly a big component, but that's why we have an entire first component of our guidebook is about business continuity planning. And that certainly is an issue that really is relevant right now in real time for all of our utilities. When you get to issues around succession planning and having cross-training of people and you know, having the processes in place. So, you know, if someone on your staff, a critical employee, gets COVID and has to be isolated for weeks at a time, do you have others that are able to fill in? And is there a clear line of delegation of duty and that sort of thing, which comes with robust business continuity planning that matters following an earthquake as much as it matters in this situation we're in right now with COVID. So I would think that is more of the relevant piece of this for COVID than the microgrid component. But it's an interesting question that I haven't thought too much about.
This is Russ. Just want to jump in. I think Jared nailed it. I think that the biggest impact from COVID is on our customers, and the you know, the whole reason we're thinking about microgrids or any of these resilience measures is to make sure our customers get what they need, and the customer makeup, you know, changes under COVID. Different services become more important than others. The load shifts in different ways, and some of those changes are probably going to be lasting. I know many companies are talking about, you know, they've been able to do teleworking successfully, and so what does the new normal look like when they're going back? So I think that ultimately it changes the makeup of the customer and what's important to the customer, and that's really should change how we think about any kind of mitigation or solution that we deploy out there.
Thanks, and I got a note from Michael Hornsby with some clarifications to his previous question. So I'm going to try unmuting you, Michael, so that you can clarify the question that you wanted to ask.
Oh, thank you. Hi, it's Mike Hornsby. My question really wasn't what's the value of resilience. The question is, which microgrid itself is more likely to be resilient? That is microgrid design A or design B more likely to keep the lights on? One example might be, is undergrounding worth it? We have a couple of designs where we have about 20 different switches on a microgrid to switch particular segments of a circuit or a microgrid on and off, and others are in effect a ring bus with a single point of failure. So do all those switches add operational flexibility, or do they add complexity that's more likely to fail? I'm trying to come to grips with those sort of questions.
Yeah, this is Russ. I think it's a good question, and I don't know if this feels like a cop-out, but it's probably a case-by-case basis, right? So depends on what you're trying to solve with it, and like I said in my presentation, every microgrid's different. You know, you've seen one microgrid, so I think you got to look at what are the points of failure, because you're trying to whenever we do any kind of planning for the power system, we're looking at what is the redundancy that you have built into the system, and do you have a single point of failure? Do you have multiple points of failure? And I think that the more equipment and the more complexity, sometimes you make things easier, but sometimes you just introduce points of failure. So it's definitely a consideration when deploying it. I tend to be of the mindset that simpler is better. If you can make it simple and but you can build in redundancy, I think that's the right approach.
This is Jared. I'll add one more thing to that because I think it's a really interesting question. I thought to myself, well, maybe the right question, or I'd like to flip the question around rather than what different size or different deployment would, you know, potentially get the most resiliency. Maybe it's what types of communications or control technologies are necessary to really realize some of that resiliency. And I think if you have a simple facility microgrid, I think economies of scale would apply if there's certain control mechanisms and communication schemes that allow for that microgrid to communicate to the larger system and provide benefits beyond the boundaries, I would say that would, you would be able to capture more benefits there.
Yeah, this is Adam. I'll tag on here a little bit. So I'm thinking about this from two different ways. One is the design of the microgrid itself. So certainly, will it withstand the threat that you're seeking to be resilient against? That's an important consideration, right? Is your rooftop solar on a building that's not seismically sound and the earthquake's going to collapse the building? It's an important consideration. Undergrounding lines, probably not the best case when earthquakes are your major threat, but maybe it is if it's ice storms. So that's one thought I would have there. And then I think also, and so certainly it's case by case, as Russell mentioned. I don't think that's a cop out. It's very, very much on point. But then also, it's also case by case in terms of what is that particular threat and what is the duration that you're likely to need resilient power. So we're in a situation here, given the extreme impacts expected from the Cascadia subduction zone, where we're not looking at hours or days like you might get from a public safety power shutoff, but we're talking weeks, months. And in that case, there's gonna be serious challenges with getting liquid fuel resupply. So if you have diesel generators, you're gonna quickly run out. But if you have some solar and storage, you'll be happy to have any power as opposed to no power when as the weeks stretch on. So I think that's another important consideration is really what is the threat against which you're trying to become resilient.
Thank you. And I'm going to briefly paraphrase one final question, and we'll move into the members only portion of this webinar. So the question is about whether there's a difference in community acceptance of, I would say, option A, a microgrid project in a rural community that might support some critical infrastructure within that community, like hospitals, or versus B, just a wind and solar project. Is there any kind of difference in how communities respond to installing storage and controls on site that would actually power infrastructure within their communities versus just a wind and solar project that would feed into the grid?
Yeah, I'll take a shot at that since I talk so much about the rural areas of Oregon. It's an interesting thought, and I'd like to find out the answer because we're still early stages here in Oregon at this point in terms of deploying these kind of projects. But the premise of the question is an interesting one, and I suspect that it would make a difference in terms of how those kind of projects are received in the community. We certainly historically have gotten and some of the kind of the opposite of that, which is that the wind turbines going up and maybe selling power out of state to maybe one of the utilities on this presented on this call with me. So we hear those kind of comments sometimes. So my guess is there would be more receptiveness if there were local assets there that were helping to support community resilience. So I hope we find that out soon.
Yeah, and Adam, like you said, I mean, it's about defining the problem first. So if this community has a problem with accessing power, and if there's threats that could potentially keep them out of keeping the lights on for weeks at a time, then certainly there's benefit in having controls and capability to island and ride through that event. So it's really about the needs and identifying those first.
Yeah, and I would just say that I do think people put a value on things that are local. So if it's locally grown, locally run business, locally powered, there is a value. It's hard to put value on what that is or put a number to it, but I think people are generally more accepting of things that impact them, but it provides a value to them, rather than, as Adam said, you see a windmill, but it doesn't provide you any necessary benefit. So it's a good question. I don't know what the number is that you put to it, but I definitely see that people put a value on it.
Thank you so much. This is Kirsten. I'm back online, and I apologize for the technical difficulties earlier. Our internet just decided to give out right when the webinar was starting, so apologies for that. Thank you very much to all three speakers, and also wanted to thank you, the Department of Energy, for supporting our microgrid state working group. I think these were excellent conversations and presentations and questions, and I also want to thank SEPA for making the playbook available to all of the attendees. So with that, I would like to ask all the members of the working group to stay on, and all the attendees that are not part of the working group to leave the webinar. This will be the working group only portion of the webinar. So thank you for attending. If you're not a member of the working group, I just ask you to leave the webinar. And if you are a member of the working group, to just remain on the line while I stop the recording and